You may remember Frederick Winslow Taylor introduced him as an efficiency expert. He studied Bethlehem steel. Consider the strides over the course of the early 20th century that are made in terms of the rationalization of business, management styles. And also, in that same vein, consider things like capital, financing, and distribution networks and the degree to which they are refined by the 1920s. Because by that time, many of these distribution chains, many of these networks have been, I mentioned refined earlier, but they've been expanded so that you begin to see things in the 20s like networks of car dealerships, right? Franchising allows corporations to deal with private interests locally, but to expand nationally. One other innovation of the 1920s that we see is the grocery store. And one of the first chains was the A&P. But we'll also see, for instance, Piggly Wiggly coming out of Memphis, Tennessee. Business methods matter. And they too are cultural. They have to do with how you view the work that you're doing. Let me throw out a third element here then. And that is, I think, another major factor in the 1920s and the business expansion that occurs, and that's advertising. And that's fairly huge as well. Remember during the First World War, the degree to which propaganda had become an element to build this 100% Americanism, to build national patriotism so that total mobilization for the war effort would be possible. In other words, to inculcate the habits, the thinking, the culture of national discipline so that you didn't have to waste government resources constantly regulating, overseeing, and enforcing laws. It's much cheaper when you can convince people it's in their own interest to obey laws than to spend time, money, and effort forcing people to obey laws. Well, that lesson is one that is, I think, very readily learned by the marketing agencies that emerge in the 1920s. And they build upon this tradition of government posters and government marketing efforts for Liberty bonds, etc. The idea, for instance, of celebrity endorsements is huge. It takes off in the 1920s, as do color advertisements. But it's not anything particularly new, because now they're using these methods to advertise things like appliances. Well, how do you sell appliances? Well, all you have to do really is look around today. If you watch TV or even if you're watching something online and there are advertisements, by and large, sex continues to sell. It emerges, I think, most forcefully in the 1920s, though there are elements of this kind of relationship between advertising and sex that go much further back, maybe to the ancient world and further. But let me just suggest one, and that's some of the first playing cards or collecting cards. We don't really think of them nowadays or have as baseball cards that come with a pack of chewing gum. And yet it was a sales marketing tool to put those playing cards or picture cards, not only of baseball players, but of actresses, not in bubblegum packs initially, but in cigarette packs. And this goes back to Buck Duke and American Tobacco Company. Somewhat lurid pictures of actresses that even Buck Duke's own father, a devout Methodist, didn't care for, these methods that his son was willing to use to sell cigarettes. 1920s, I think, and we'll talk more about the cultural changes taking place, but this notion in advertising that you can now use openly sexuality as a tool for marketing emerges with a vengeance. So it's not entirely new, but it sure is more powerful and more overt. In essence, what you advertise is not the appliance itself per se, but the ideal, the dream, the fantasy. That if you use one particular product, for instance, I have I have a poster that I often use for Listerine, then that product's use will make you more appealing, either in terms of masculinity or femininity. In other words, if you're trying to attract a young lady in the 1920s and you want to be able to get close or intimate, then you better use Listerine. Personal hygiene products. How do you sell them to a society that by and large hasn't used them before the 1920s? Well, you convince people that in order to be successful in love, they need to use your product. Marketing, advertisements, sex, using the new technology, especially radio, but also the newspapers that have been growing in popularity since the late 19th century. Using all the media, all the technology available, you're trying to market, you're trying to sell, and you'll use sex to do it. That's one of those identifiers, I think, of the 1920s. And one of the examples of that I often use in lecture is a book by a fellow named Bruce Barton. It's a book that came out in 1925 called The Man Nobody Knows. And it tells the story of a figure, sort of the greatest manager, who forged in a very short time an organization intended to spread a message. In other words, a marketing organization. This marketing organization, within a matter of just a few short years, was able to essentially conquer the world because of the techniques that were used, the products sold, the techniques used, etc. It turns out that the example Bruce Barton relies upon for his model salesperson, model sales manager, was a Jewish leader. In fact, a Jewish leader from Israel. Barton points to no less a religious figure than Jesus Christ as sort of the greatest sales manager the world has ever known. The Man Nobody Knows of the title is a reference to Christ. It's an interesting conception to me, this blending of good business and good religious practice, that the one could be juxtaposed against another. But most importantly about the 1920s, I think it says how impressive and important business had become. As one saying goes, business had become the business of America. That is important. I've got a little cartoon again that I often use for these lectures of a little salesman, because it seemed that everyone was into the market. Everyone had something to sell. Everyone saw the possibility in the 20s for getting rich. Now, everyone's always, an exaggeration, but nonetheless, that you could get rich, that there was possibility. So here in this cartoon, a little salesman comes up to knock on a door. He's got a little suitcase, a briefcase, product to sell. In the next square, he's welcomed in the door by the homeowner, or what appears to be the homeowner, and he's escorted to a chair, and the little salesman with his little mustache is then given a huge sales pitch by the homeowner. And the last block of the comic shows the little salesman highly agitated and disappointed because instead of selling something, the salesman has become the customer. And he's walking away with a book that the homeowner had sold to him. That just goes to show, that cartoon kind of gets at this notion that in America in the 1920s, it seemed that everybody was out to make the buck. Everybody seemed to have been out, conducting the business of America, which was business. But to foreshadow just a bit, and then to wrap up this segment, I'd like to suggest one other consideration here in terms of this, the business of America's business, and that is exactly how much of the business success of the 1920s was based on credit. Now, you've heard your smart folks, you've heard about the stock market collapse of 1929 leading into the Great Depression. But it wasn't just in stocks that people had borrowed money and invested. One of the key ingredients allowing middle America, working class America, to purchase automobiles and to have access to appliances that culturally, remember, the Americans began to think we must have these new appliances. We need to have these new appliances. Otherwise, we're not keeping up with the middle class. Otherwise, we're not keeping up with our neighbors. It becomes a kind of cultural drive, as well as a drive for greater leisure, which, again, it goes back to culture. But back to the original point here. Sorry for the digression. Not everybody's going to be able to afford the goods that define one as part of this growing sort of middle America in the 1920s. Not everybody's going to afford the new car and the appliances and the radio, and it's going to be tough. What lets more people afford it than not, more people than might have otherwise, will be installment credit. The idea that instead of taking out a bulk loan, the producer of the good, the business in question, will either provide access to credit and allow you to pay back weekly, or arrange for credit to allow you to pay back weekly or monthly. This kind of installment plan, buying, became a defining factor of the 1920s affluence. And that is a point worth making. That this affluence, so impressive on the surface during the 1920s, was supported by speculative borrowing in the markets, supported by installment plan credit for the lower classes and much of the middle class. And you start putting that all together with those sectors of the economy that didn't reach the heights. Sectors like the coal industry, where prices continued to be low. Iron and steel, where prices continued to be low. You start thinking about not all sectors firing on all cylinders, and it makes you wonder how very stable, after all, that post-boom and bust economy of the 1920s really was. We'll pick up next time, really focused in on the cultural aspects of the 1920s and the Jazz Age.